Good morning, everyone, and very warm welcome on behalf of the Carlis to the launch of today's report, Lagging Behind Energy Efficiency in Low Viability Properties. Before we start, huge thanks to Gavin Dick and all colleagues from the National Residential Landlords Association, Property Mark, for supporting this report. And huge thanks also for Zain Qureshi for being the author and for Joe Azette for shepherding our findings through to the final stage at what I think, for all of us agreed, is a very propitious time, given the much delayed, long awaited, but final publication on Tuesday of the government's heat and buildings strategy. So it's all there, and all we've got to worry about is this time next week responding to the spending review budget and the levelling up white paper and all that. So that's kind of the context in which we find ourselves. To debate the findings of this report, very grateful indeed to have as usual, a top panel of experts to debate this. I've got on my right, Ros Bulid, Head of Policy for the Green Alliance. Those of you with long memories before COVID, we did a very happy report with you, the Route to Clean Growth, which we published in 2019 at the Connected Places Catapult, which brings me to our next speaker, Dr. Erin Walsh, Director of the Built Environment for the Connected Places Catapult. And finally, to give both a unique vantage, a local political view, as well as a national political view, as Councillor and MP, David Simmons, MP for Ruislip, Northwood and Pinner, and former Deputy Leader of Hillingdon, Vice Chair of the LGA. So we've got, I think, enough brains in the room to answer some of the main questions arising from this agenda. A quick few points on the report. What do we get from the publication of the strategy this week? Well, I hope very much a clearer sense of the pace and direction of what's expected and to get our homes fit for the age of net zero. I think it's a very salient fact that by 2050, even then, 4 in every 5 homes, 80% of homes will be today's existing dwelling stock. This means we're going to have to more or less use what we have, which is good in terms of not expending further carbon than we need to. But it also means we're going to have to adapt to the technological challenges as much as the financial. In terms of domestic energy use, you all know these facts probably better than we do. It accounts for 14% of overall emissions, and the overwhelming majority of homes in England, 90%, are still reliant on fossil fuels. What do we also get this week? Well, the pace to retrofit isn't happening at anything like the pace and the scale it should be. Government's very, they know this. What do we hit this year? Well, 2020, 6% of annual targets of 600,000 for heat pumps. Other key targets way below schedule. Look at 9% of cavity wall insulation, less than 3% of loft insulation, and 2% of solid wall installation. So that's kind of the national context. As a place-focused think tank, here at the Carlis, and I'm Jonathan Thoreau, and I'm Chief Executive of the Carlis, I need to say so at the beginning. One thing we can't overlook is the impact of huge regional variations and properties. What this is going to have, a huge impact in incentivizing homeowners to make the switch over, landlords, social landlords, and down the line. So this is the background to our report today, Lagging Behind Energy Efficiency in Low Viability Properties. And what we're arguing for at the Carlis, we're making the case for the government to give serious consideration to the very fact of regional variation in house prices and dwelling stock when it comes to installing heat pumps and considering the decarbonisation targets. From our research, what do we uncover? Well, primarily, look, we all knew this. In some local authority areas, the North and Midlands, the estimated cost of retrofitting might be maybe a quarter, 25% of home property. The median house price is just under 100,000. You can do the maths. But here we are in Westminster, in parts of Penston and Chelsea, for example, where median house properties are 1,300,000, we're talking at 2%. This is an impact. This has an impact. It's a political impact in red wall seats in Burnley, for example. 4 and 5 dwellings need to retain EPC grade C standards, and that's going to be a quarter of the cost. Kensington and Chelsea, it's maybe 1.8%. So you can see how some people are going to find it. Some homeowners, some landlords are going to find it easier to finance this than others. I think we've also got to consider the different type of tenure too. The occupier owners and socially rented homes have different timescale. They've got until 2035 to make the switch, compared to a 2025 deadline for the private rented centre for new tenancies, and 2028 for all tenancies. So I think what we're talking about here is this split incentive is something that needs to be dealt with, and also the salient fact that landlords will be doing this. They're not going to receive the benefits of the lower energy. Their tenants are. We've got to underpin that case for retrofitting too. So to this end, what we're calling for at the car list is for council areas in less affluent parts of the country where property values are lower. We're making a case for cooperation and collaboration. We're talking about setting up one-stop shops on a sub-regional basis to engage with residential landlords. The purpose of doing so is to retrofit at pace and to use that kind of aggregated scale you can use. And for many of our reports to the car list, we always advocate for local government's convening role, its collaborative role. I think there's the energy and the determination to do so. And I guess a side benefit to that, maybe a less manifest benefit, is that will enable more bespoke solutions to individual properties, individual landlords and situations. So I think we can use existing strategic powers, general power and competence to do so. And clearly we've got the economic element to consider too. The sub-regional scale, this is an issue of skills as much as supply chain. So really, we're talking for local authorities that you've got something in the skills for jobs agenda, make use of that to make sure a retrofit is going to work in your area. And come up with local retrofit job strategies that make use of all the opportunities you've got, both skills and supply chains. I think what we also uncovered in the report is, as with all central government campaigns, we don't have a central office for information anymore. It's a lot more nuanced, a lot more skilled how we get messages across, but it needs to be a clear, concise, charged message from government to inform all landlords, all property owners, just what's at stake, what the targets are, what to do. We need a better, bolder communications campaign. And in terms of the funding, clearly we've got all the fun, the fair with spending review of budget to look forward this week. There were certain funding elements in the strategy released on Tuesday, but front loading as much of the spending as we can to get things done at pace so we can learn, adapt from pioneers wouldn't be that bad an idea. With all our kind of local cases, there's always got to be something at stake here. What if we don't change tack? What if we don't make a difference? And I guess unless we're tailoring and having a localised approach to retrofit that takes account of regional house price variation and local economics, it's that dread phrase in local government, isn't it, David? One size fits all. I'd really like to excise it from the local government dictionary. It seems too pat a term, but it does apply here. A one-size-fits-all approach will not work for this. We need a localised strategy. Otherwise, what's at stake here? We risk deepening regional inequality in different parts of the country when it comes to retrofitting. And that's it. Net zero has to work as a one nation agenda, and it's got to work equally in all places. And we've got to make sure that local government's doing its bit, industry their part, as well as support from central government for funding and clarity of information to make that happen. So that's our report, lagging behind. We've got copies of a summary of it on your chairs here, and the full thing in all its manifest glory is available from the car list website and all good policy routes. So that's enough from me at the car list as chair. I'd very much like to hear views from our panel. I never really have a view about how we ought to do things. So Ross, if you bear with me, I always go alphabetic on the basis. It's kind of, it's fair. And also my name being, surname being a W, I always knew I'd get away with it last of all at school. So you must be used to it by now.
All right.
So if I ask Ross to lead us off our panelists, their response to this agenda. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. That was a really good introduction. And really pleased to see this report out there. So for those of you who don't know Greenlights, we're an environmental NGO and think tank working for ambitious environmental policy. Obviously, buildings is quite a large portion of the UK's carbon footprint, a key area, and agree with a lot of what Jonathan said about the kind of the importance of actually really seizing this agenda, which I think has been rich in disappointments for those of us following buildings, decarbonisation of building strategy in the UK, from the cancellation of zero carbon homes, the delay to heat and building strategy, the green homes grant. I mean, you have to be quite stoical to work in this area, I think. But nonetheless, I mean, there have been improvements since 1990, so we know it can be done. Those have stalled recently, and hopefully things can pick up again at scale. I mean, my take on the heat and building strategy yesterday was that it's a very, along with the net zero strategy, a kind of very tech-friendly approach, not much kind of expectation of behaviour change, and a real kind of hope that costs can come down in heat pumps particularly, but we're seeing that with electric vehicles and across the range of technologies. And that's really encouraging that there's what begins to look like a kind of comprehensive strategy on heat pumps, like prime the market, get some heat pumps rolled out at scale, and then start to mandate it on the boiler suppliers, so you put the responsibility on them. So that, I mean, we could do with more funding, but that's a kind of a good start. But much more disappointing, I think, on energy efficiency from our side. We could obviously come back to the details later, but I think that's a real missed opportunity. It is harder to see those kind of tech savings possibly in energy efficiency. It's a kind of more manual role going in to do energy efficiency, but I'll come back to a bit later to some of the opportunities that we think there are there still. But the missed opportunity is in the savings and in the wider benefits of warm, cosy, well insulated homes. We know the cost to the NHS of our housing stock, our poor housing stock, is about 2 billion a year. So there's a real saving there if you could look in that perspective, and not just kind of at the upfront cost of supporting energy efficiency. So that's a kind of, I think, an ongoing frustration for us and others. There's also the savings that you could bring for households in poorer areas. I think we've put it down to getting all homes to EPC C would save households 7.5 billion a year, which is quite considerable. So that saving to the economy is currently being lost as well. And if we pursue a tech approach where we just switch boilers for heat pumps or for hydrogen, we miss that opportunity. And in fact, some of those, in the meantime, there could be extra costs from some of those fuels. Completely agree with the kind of challenges, particularly for private landlords and the split incentive where they're being asked to invest without seeing the payback. And I mean, even for owner occupiers, we're asking them to take quite a leap of faith in kind of investing in kind of improvements to their home that may not pay back for some time. I think that's, in terms of kind of thinking about solutions, there's a real opportunity there to sell those kind of wider comfort benefits. And I think time and time again, that's been missed, and it's all been about savings on your electricity and gas bill, which will take longer. And there's the challenge of complex buildings, which I think we haven't begun to address.
Yes.
That's kind of at the individual level, and then obviously how we get this at scale, hugely challenging, the skills, providing the kind of supply chain of skills. So I suppose in the government's defence, in terms of the kind of level of funding that we saw yesterday, Tuesday, for retrofit, I mean, that if you flood the market with funding, there aren't necessarily providers. So as long as we get a kind of steady increase, we could live with that. But it is disappointing to see heat pumps not accompanied by funding for energy efficiency. I think that might be setting them up for failure. Just in terms of the solutions, I mean, there's too many really things that we would like to go into all of them, but I think just to pick a few, I think that kind of selling the wider benefits is important. I think considering the role of energy efficiency across a kind of broader suite of housing, really important. And then I think we would like to see a bit more investment in in deep retrofit, so kind of really whole house, multi-street retrofit programs that make use of really cutting edge technologies, drones for measurements, kind of prefabricated industrial parts that can then be applied to buildings. Those kind of and if you do it properly, a kind of energy sprung model. For those that know energy sprung, that's also solar, etc. in the building too. That's definitely not cheap. You know, that at the moment costs sort of 70 grand for a house, but with kind of just 120 million of government investment, the suppliers think they can halve those costs. That's not going to be suitable for all houses, but the more we can kind of bring those technologies along, the hope is in time they could also trickle down, and we'll see more of that applied to the general housing market. In terms of kind of local authorities, a very huge role there as well, and really frustrating to see, as ever, the kind of government supporting. It's begun to address some of the issues that we've identified. There is more support promised in the net zero strategy, but it's more support for those councils that are on top of this already. There's very little for those that are really struggling, and I think Localis' recommendation around kind of aggregating, working together is really valuable on that front. And the more councils can help their neighbours work collaboratively and take everyone along with them, really welcome. So my final thing is just to kind of look into the real future, and maybe a bit tech friendly as well, and sort of hopeful is that we can revise the EPC rating system. And I think if we were to do that and use kind of make the most of the falling cost of sensors and things, we could actually get live information from people's houses, which would hopefully really engage people a lot more, and they could see the real savings, and we could link that to investment in different funding models. So that's my kind of long-term hope, which maybe have been a bit much for the heat and building strategy, but yes. Anyway, but sorry for a slightly sort of, I want everything basically. That's
Okay, so the Freddie Mercury approach, you want it all, you want it now.
Yeah.
Right? That's good. Of course, thank you so much for getting us off to such a very strong start. I'm next to invite David, who, one of your other hats, you also chair your party parliamentary group on housing and planning. It's a great pleasure to introduce you again. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jonathan. And likewise, I think that was a really helpful tour of the horizon, really, in this context. So, future of green policy, as everyone will know, is the subject of much debate just down the road. We know the reason we're here is that there is a carbon cycle in the planet, and though human activity is tiny by comparison with what nature is doing, we know that it's enough to have thrown that carbon cycle out of balance. And the key challenge, I think, for policy is to translate that debate into what do I, as a householder, what do you as a landlord, what do you as a building company, what do you as an individual in your purchasing decisions have to do in order to address those issues? And what are the benefits that you might see either for yourself, for your finances, for your company, for your family, for your community, as a result of those actions? I think a couple of things that, to me, are going to be very relevant to this debate. The first is to recognise that there will be bumps in the road on this particular journey. So at the moment, as we heard at the Conservative Party conference, there is what was described as a wall of money that is chasing green investment. And a number of those things are not going to deliver. So we can anticipate that there will come a point in the not too distant future where there will be a view that some of these things, some of these technologies, some of these ideas will be seen as a bubble, as being things that don't deliver. And that will mean there will then be a debate about the value and the usefulness of the whole direction of this policy. So I think we need to anticipate that and demonstrate that we're thinking about the things that are proven to make a constructive difference. But most importantly, I think the role of local authorities is often about translating that policy into things that people can do in their communities. And organisations like schools, like hospitals, community places like swimming pools, sports centres, what they can do that contributes usefully to this wider environmental agenda. So for me, there are a number of ways in which that can happen, starting perhaps with something very obvious, and that's the use of building regulations. So it's very clear that statutory building regulations have been and are regularly updated in a way that reflects the latest technology that's available in the market on everything from installation to the quality of things like the airtightness of a building, through to insulation for walls, floors, and the efficiency of the types of heating technology and so on that are installed. Now, clearly that implies mainly to either new builds or to substantial refurbishment of existing housing stock. I think that brings us on to the second big issue, which is that whilst there is really good evidence around things like the passive house model for what a householder can do to make a difference, the UK has a very old housing stock by comparison with most of the rest of Europe. And actually, culturally, we quite like our old homes as well. When we think about what is popular in terms of new developments, the neo-Georgian style is the one that most consistently the customer seems to like. So clearly, we need to be thinking about what ways we have about extending the benefits of that new technology into older housing stock. And I say from personal and very recent experience, I can see even in the last few years that the market is bringing things like insulation products that are relatively low disruption, that can be installed, that can make a really positive difference. So how do we make sure that householders who are thinking about that know how to make a really good choice and one that is relevant to their local area? Jonathan touched on the issue of the structure benefits. If you're a landlord, what's the return to you of investing money in something that only really benefits your tenant? So how do we make sure that we have financial products available that enable landlords to make the right decision in a way that benefits, for example, their block? And I think there's an interesting policy question here. The government has something that people may have heard of, the nudge unit. It's about thinking about how we encourage people to make better decisions that may be quite small things, but tweaks in their behaviour that produce a bigger benefit to society. And I think this is an area that would really benefit from that scrutiny. What are the things that would encourage that individual to decide that they are going to have an air source heat pump rather than upgrading their gas boiler, for example? Why would you choose to go a bit further with your installation? And again, having been through this process, personally, I think this is, again, a challenge between translating the policy at a national level into what it means for individuals. Having explored the question of, should I get a ground source heat pump? And I discover it's 8 times the cost of a gas boiler. It involves digging up the entirety of the garden, including demolishing the shed. And also, in order to operate that, it isn't sustainable because ground source heat pumps extract the heat from the ground. So after a certain lifetime, you have to dig it all up again and bury it again lower. So anybody who may be thinking about buying that house in succession, their surveyor is going to be saying, well, you're about to have to spend £50,000, £60,000 renewing the whole of the system, and therefore it isn't quite a sustainable option from the householder's point of view, as it sounds like it's going to be. There are ways around that, but I think we've got to address that so that as consumers, we've got the information to make informed choices and make the right ones. So what does this Localis research demonstrate for me? First is that councils are enormously good at doing the work, and government have learned from the way in which previous green projects have been developed, that actually local authorities are very efficient at getting that money spent on the things that make the most difference. And it's not just in the context of greening, it's also in the context of other things. So the Decent Homes standard, I think, offers an interesting model where local authorities were not instructed specifically what to do, but were instructed to improve the quality of the housing stock with funding provided through a particular financial structure, but with local discretion down to the householder level about exactly what that money was spent on that would bring about the biggest improvement in that particular property. So I think that's an interesting model. The second thing we need to consider is how advancing technology will make a big difference. And I think we're seeing all sorts of different organisations in the industry coming up with new ideas all the time, all of which will make a difference to what happens at the individual householder level. And the final reason why I think local is absolutely crucial. My constituency, right at North Pinner, borders on the 2 locations that consistently produce the highest temperature readings in the UK, Northolt Aerodrome and Heathrow Airport. Now, it speculates probably because there's a huge concrete apron soaking up the sunshine, which drives up the temperature. But we do know that climate is a local thing as well as a global thing. In South Wales, where I grew up, it rains a lot, but it's not usually all that cold. And what that tells you is that the technology that you need that will make the biggest difference in the housing and the other buildings in those places will vary. And local authorities are much better placed to identify that what will make the biggest difference in an area that's damp but mild is different from what makes the biggest difference in an area that's dry and hot. So in the UK, we have such a range of localised climates. We need to recognise that if we're going to get the most for the taxpayers' money, we need to tap into that local knowledge so that the things that we are doing are making the biggest difference that they possibly can for each taxpayer.
David, thank you very much. Tour de force, thank you, on all level. As this time of proceedings, just to remind myself, we do have a hashtag for the event, hashtag lagging behind holds that saying, but Dr. Erin Walsh, like me, your surname's on the W side of the spectrum, you get the privilege of going last.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jonathan. Good morning, all. I just need to make a clarification in case there's a medical emergency or a deep academic question. I'm not a doctor. I'm happy for it to be on there this morning, but just to clarify.
I must have picked up from someone, very sorry.
Someone, I like that you picked it up. No, I appreciate it.
I forgot what record it, but we had a dinner when Kwasi Kwarteng was Brexit minister. I think on his sort of table thing, I made a minister's statement. He was past. He found that very amusing. Look where he is now, I say, Erin.
Brilliant. Thank you. And yeah, I thank you both, Ross and David. I think you both provided a really thorough strategic overview in the context of the discussion this morning. And again, thanks to Localist and NRLA in terms of this research. I wanted to kind of maybe dive a bit then into the more specifics around the energy efficiency in the hard to reach properties.
Thank you.
So thinking about that kind of regional variance, and I suppose, you know, from years working in the northwest of the UK and also working in the northeast, I've kind of seen that variance firsthand. And I thought some of the stats in your report that you mentioned this morning, you know, when you think of house values of just under 100,000, and a quarter of that is what that kind of retrofit, or sorry, just the heating transformation looks like, and a retrofit to the home. That's also an annual salary for some homes in that area as well. So that regional variance is quite substantive. And if we think about it, about not just the tenure type or the building type, I should say, you know, there's a real human element to this here. And I think to David's point about that local approach is going to be really key. And I welcome that as one of the recommendations of the report. I think you're onto something with the one-stop shop. I know the work that we did in 2019 on the road to retrofit, we brought together about 50 stakeholders across industry, you know, from government, local government, academia, RSLs, other asset owners. That was really called out, that place where people could go to, not an online platform, but a physical space where people could go and understand the products, the services, and the financial packages, because we don't have it in one place, and it's quite a minefield for people. I think there's another point with that as well. The likes of the Green Finance Institute, they too have come to this conclusion. So I think we're all onto something there. So I think there's an action there to be made. And really about kind of that focusing in on the local. I also wanted to call out, absolutely local authorities are doing tremendous work in this area, but they too are struggling. You know, they don't have their net zero roadmaps or their plans. Over 2/3 as of last year still didn't have a road to net zero in the UK. So for them to take on this here, it's quite substantial. So I think that point about the collaboration and partnership working is going to be really key here. And it makes me think of the likes of the cooperative approach that retrofit work are doing, where they bring the advocates together and also with the supply chain and looking at retrofit advocates for the home. So not saying that's the answer, but very much that kind of approach that maybe it sits, you know, the local authorities and other key stakeholders are partners to this here, but not actually the delivery agent. And you know, the building approach for those that worked in different parts of the UK and worked through the Housing Market Renewal Initiative, where we saw housing types of a certain age, of a certain stock, you know, undergo a broad brush demolition process. I think we've got to be very careful about taking very broad brush approaches to housing stock and housing types, and we need to really think about that more local context. So I think it's just very much to say, yeah, absolutely, welcome the kind of collaborative approach, the more localized one-stop shop. You know, our high streets need opportunities to engage people in communities, and this is a really good way to bring people together. Maybe we could borrow some of the work of the Urban Rooms Network that they've been doing across the UK. They are showing how people can be more informed about placemaking and about their local community, so we can really borrow there as well. And I think to your point, David, absolutely, you know, we've got to be very careful about technology being obsolete. These are very substantial investments for people and for larger asset owners. I like how the heat and building strategy calls out the no regret approach. And I think to credit this report finding, there's a lot of no regret approach that you've outlined.
It's our Edith Piaf moment, isn't it? No, Okay, well, thank you. Well, look, thank you so much for our panelists really setting the scene. Thank you for taking the time to read the report, to find what you found most important from this agenda. We've got until 11:30. We always leave on time. So quickly, do we have got time for exchange, for dialogue, for questions, for people to say, oh, I've got more of a comment than a question, really? I don't care. Let's have some comments and questions, please. Anything on?
No, I'll throw to the Zoom to questions now.
Okay. Any sort of thoughts, comments from the floor about what you've heard about either the financial challenges? Great, we have a hand up. Please give us your name and your question.
I'm Sophia from Gas UK. So I think this is absolutely fascinating. I think one clear thing that you can see is that in terms of who's paying the most necessarily, if we look at these retrofit costs for areas away from London and the south, that's where these policies could potentially letting people down. What do you think, are the next steps then for these areas? Because this one size fits all approach that seems to have come out to the rural buildings isn't necessarily going to give these homes, these households solutions that they can take in the next couple of years, just because of the amount of money that's involved. Should hybrids have been supported more in the heat and building strategy than they have? Has bioenergy actually been given an opportunity? I'd be really interested in your thoughts.
Ross, can you take that one up first? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, one thing about levelling up in kind of harder to reach areas is that is also where the opportunities are, where the jobs in kind of a really well-funded retrofit programme would be most appreciated as well. So I think that there is an opportunity there. In terms of kind of technology mix, I think hybrid heat pumps could play a really important role, and I think they do often get overlooked. So that I think that's a fair point. I'm a little sceptical about bioenergy, just generally. I've got a long history of kind of using bio solutions and then thinking actually maybe they're not the best approach. And we do also, we have a situation in which the chemicals industry is expecting to use bio-based materials as a feedstock. We're hoping to do a lot of BECCS potentially, so bioenergy, carbon capture and storage at kind of drakes and other power stations and storing the resulting carbon. And, I mean, there isn't an endless supply of land, and you start to potentially kind of have indirect effects on land use elsewhere and the risk of deforestation, etc. So a little sceptical on that front, but yeah, hybrids would definitely think there could be a space for that, exploring that.
Many thanks, Ross. Aaron, David's coming on.
Yeah, happy to. So I think Ross has covered the energy side of it. I think the question around kind of the strategy as well, what I thought was definitely an opportunity that we didn't see come out as clearly or strongly as it could have done was, as Ross mentioned earlier, the whole deep retrofit approach as well. So that kind of, we're very focused on the energy side of it, but actually there's a work here on what we can do on the deep retrofit. So that kind of more insulation, more on kind of thinking about just the home building envelope, the material itself. And I think that there's an opportunity to work with homeowners who are about to undergo construction work on their home. And there was an opportunity really there to bolster that more. And I think that was something that, was missing. It seemed more weight in terms of the energy approach than the actual building side of it.
Thank you, Aaron. David?
Well, just very quickly, again, I think one of the challenges is that the political centre of gravity about this debate has mainly been in cities so far, and that's profoundly unhelpful, certainly in terms of Parliament being willing to allocate resources to any of these projects. Because what's clear, I think of the example of electric vehicles. So the average price of a second-hand car in the UK is about £16,000. The average household budget for a new car or for a used car is about £10,000. Starting price for an electric car, which is generally a very small city car, is about £30,000. So for most people in the UK, when you're thinking about that, this is completely out of reach. It's out of the question to even consider it. I think that's why the point that you make is crucial. One size is not going to fit all. What works for a household in a rural area who have to take 2 children to different schools on a 60-mile round trip twice each day is very different from what works in Chelsea, where you may have no need to use a vehicle at all. What works when you have access to large amounts of land in which you can install ground source heat pumps is different from what works on the 19th floor of a tower block in the centre of the city. So I think what we're going to see, and we've already seen it a little bit in the media coverage, is that there will be challenges, firstly, from people who are living in towns, and actually when we talk about levelling up, the sense of being left behind mostly is in the towns around our major cities, who see the city getting all the benefit of public transport and technology investment and nothing for them. So firstly, what does this agenda mean for those towns? And then what does it mean for our rural areas? And the solutions clearly are not going to be the same for every place.
Thank you very much. And you raised a point there about sort of planning back at the dim and distant past 2 weeks ago at the Conservative Party conference. The Council was launching our report, Building Communities, about creating a clean and good growth future. Doesn't it talk about the panel, not just here? In terms of what we've seen this week, is there any connect at government, at central government level between what's going on here and the planning reform we're expecting in the housing planning bill? How's that meant? You love your concrete. We love concrete examples, Dave. Love to know your example about your backyard. Clearly, it's going to apply to everyone else's. This is a planning issue as much as anything else. Where you're going to cite heat pumps and all the rest of it. Has enough thought been given? What thought do we needs to be given to make this truly join up? Any thoughts? Any hope, Ros? You are kind of long-term hope today.
I mean, I don't think I'm very well placed at the moment to know what's going to come out planning bill. I was a little concerned, for instance, thinking about the stuff we've talked about today, about kind of the extended permitted development. If we're trying to kind of encourage homeowners and find levers to get homeowners to upgrade their properties, having less scrutiny from planning officials because you've got more permitted development doesn't seem particularly helpful. Also, we were concerned about the kind of zoning approach that could see less scrutiny potentially as well. We've got less community engagement about siting, so more risk of buildings being sited without good connections to public transport. Which was a major concern, but there was potential for the sort of infrastructure levies to be used potentially to support that, and kind of would really like to see some leverage there if that happens. We are seeing quite strong promises around the National Planning Policy Framework being more climate aligned, which would be really welcome. And finally, Future Homes Standard, we would have liked to see it coming a bit sooner. But I mean, in terms of kind of getting that at scale rollout, things like heat pumps, testing those, I think that was really encouraging. So a kind of mixed bag, I think.
Thank you very much. Dave, how do you think this could or should align?
So I think in terms of planning, I mean, clearly most of the things that we're talking about today are dealt with by building regulations, which will apply to all permitted development anyway. So I think the building regulations should cover the ground on that area, but there'll need to be some scrutiny to ensure that happens, and that what's reflected in the National Planning Policy Framework means that any applicant knows that the expectation is that they will meet this high standard, and that is built into the financing and then ultimately the design of whatever it is that they want to build. I think Jonathan's point at the start is going to be critical. The UK has a relatively old housing stock, and most of it is still going to be in use for the foreseeable future. That's partly a history of our planning, it's partly to do with the geography of our country, and it's not like the Netherlands, where large-scale demolition is relatively straightforward because home ownership in particular is much less factor. People are much more likely to rent their homes, so therefore landlords are in a position to do that kind of large scale provision without having to go through the same process that they would in the UK. So that is the reason why, in my view, technology is going to be critical to this. And examples like heat pumps, where we see air source heat pumps, for example, being recommended as a solution for flats. At the same time, in order to achieve housing targets, we're building smaller and smaller, higher density units in order to create the homes that we need. So there will need to be a coming together of that technology with what the planning requirements are to deliver those aspirations. And I think that's where the answer will lie to all of us.
Many thanks, David. Finally, Erin.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when I was reading the heating and building strategy, you see where it references, and one of the key ways we will regulate and support this is through planning and building regulations, absolutely. And I kind of thought, I'm sure those who are working currently on the planning bill are saying, right, okay, we will, okay. And then I'm thinking about the days when I worked in local authority, and they're thinking, really? Okay, we're going to do that as well. And so I think it, that aside, I think it does make sense, but I think it only makes sense if there's the skills, the training, the capacity to make that happen. And I think we're some way off that. Doesn't mean we can't do it, but if we're going to make that commitment, then we need to now start with the skills, the training, and the capacity. And that's what I think local authority is going to really need to do that.
Thank you very much. Any sort of further questions?
I have one here from Johanna Bradford on the Zoom, who says, Councillor Simmons is right. The costs are just too high at the moment. So how do we encourage the private sector uptake required to drive down costs? And how long do we think this will take to trickle down?
Oh, trickle down. I've had that for this, like Reaganomics again, isn't it? Great. Anyone take that?
I'm sorry.
So the question was, how do we encourage the private sector uptake required on retrofit to drive down costs, I assume by raising the scale, and how long do we think this will take to trickle down?
How do we do that? And also probably, we were chatting earlier, Erin, maybe add to that, how do we get kind of a regional scale up of the technology required too? Because I think from our perspective with the cars, there are sub-regional collaborative approaches. So how do we get the private sector to do more? How do we scale up the technology? Any thoughts, ideas?
Well, if I start with me, I'll perhaps give a starter and colleagues no doubt will have something else to say about it. So one of the things that's often a benefit from the state and the public sector taking action is that it does stimulate the market. And we know at the moment there is a huge skills shortage in this field. So anyone at the moment who's trying to do any building work will know getting both materials and labour on site is hugely challenging. So a lot of it will be about the training that goes on in colleges and demonstrating that you've got that pipeline of skilled people coming in who will go into reasonably well-paid, agreeable, safe work as they begin to enter the market, who will be able to actually physically do this work. Like the second thing we could see is with things like the decent home standard. Whilst we didn't necessarily get the cheapest kitchen or the cheapest bathroom as a consequence of that, what we did find was that it brought in people to the market who were able to do that work at scale. Because when the London Borough of England needs 12,000 bathrooms refitted, it's not the job that the local plumber is going to be able to do. It requires the larger companies to think, well, how would we meet that challenge? So I think having a decent home standard type of approach at a local level would bring some of those companies at scale. And the other factor, we do recognise that the market is making these things cheaper all the time. So the cost of high quality insulation products and the cost of the technology that can do this is going down, and the bigger that market becomes, the lower that cost will be. So there is no solution that will say next week this will change, but I think that those factors will push it in the right direction.
Many thanks, David.
Yeah, I could just say in my role as optimist, that I speak to optimists quite a lot, and they are very confident they can bring down the cost of heat pumps quite rapidly if there's enough rollout. So I would definitely agree that we should at least kind of give these technologies a chance by supporting them up front. And actually just want the EV point, which they are expensive up front as well, but with those we get, hopefully we get kind of second-hand market, which is actually cheaper. The cars bought now, the EVs bought now by rich people, when they're bought by their next owner, will cost them less over their lifetime. So the more we can stimulate the market up front, the more we get those effects for everybody. It's not straightforward, but and where we're not seeing that potentially as much as we would like is on the energy efficiency. So it feels like that just kind of is the forgotten, slightly boring solution every time, which is why I like the retrofit as well.
Great, so we front load and we Octopus speak to me, I speak to my meeting yesterday. I read more on that kind of Wheel of Fortune thing. It's always, do you get any better from your discussions? Erin.
So I think maybe I'm going to go even one step kind of before for some of the larger asset owners or registered social landlords. And I just want to bring technology in there as well. So you may have heard of a platform called View. So they support large asset owners to start to create the plans for the decarbonisation of the stock, because these large asset owners, they too have this challenge, but at a very, very large scale. So where do they start with? So the likes of View from RSLs or Chimney for the individual homeowners are platforms that are now available on the market to help you do a risk assessment, not a risk assessment, but an energy and a deep retrofit assessment of your home, and then looking at kind of de-risking your portfolio, looking at greener finance options. So I think by them also supporting these upfront technologies, not just the ground source heat pumps or the air pumps, it's also these other wraparound services that help with the planning around this decarbonisation. So just to kind of mention that. So
excellent. I have another question here from, oh no, please, to the room.
Hello, I'm Sakitra Hammond with the Retail Energy Code Company. It's really interesting to hear all this, and it feels very much about what the state can do and how to engage local authorities and what I'm not hearing is the kind of the actually completing that circle and saying actually we're engaging consumers. They understand what the opportunities are. They're not afraid of heat pumps, because right now if you're talking to people in the poorest areas, are they saying yes, heat pumps the next thing I'm thinking about? No, that's probably not what they're thinking about. They're thinking actually I just want the gas boiler to work so that I can heat my home this winter. So how are we getting people on board and saying actually this is the next phase and this is what it brings for you, as opposed to just policies that are made for local authorities to deliver.
Thank you very much. As David raised a very good point about getting bits of behavioural insights team to help nudge us along this path. It will require a push eventually some clear information. Maybe we're stuck around kind of 80 kind of economics thinking, like some kind of like tell Sid type approach to get it in people's heads that this is the case. Any thoughts around the table about how we make this a mass consumer event?
Yeah, and I think your question is absolutely spot on. And there was a YouGov poll last week, 72% of those that responded said in the next few years they're highly unlikely to go to ground or air source heat pumps. So you're absolutely right. We talk about the numbers, but at the end of this, it is people and it's about their choice. And it's very hard when you go from a combi boiler to either a ground or air source, if you look at the energy, and it's up to 3 times onwards from that. So there has to be a huge shift. And that's where I think there is a real kind of, there's a comms campaign here, there's knowledge, there's also about kind of thinking about, the heat strategy has called out the end of sales for fossil fuels by 2035 within, for boilers within the home. So it's about helping people understand that the same way the EV, there's the incentives, there was a real carrot at the beginning, but the sticks come down the line and people don't make that migration over. So on the owner-occupier side, again, it's interesting because people don't think about what is my energy into the home. People aren't really thinking that, or they're not thinking, actually, what is my EPC rating? Not many people do that, but they do think about the cost of what the bill looks like. They do think about, actually, the kitchen's really cold, or what is that black spots all over my bathroom? And I think there's something there to think about it from the point of the end user consumer perspective. And I think that's where that local one-stop shop can approach it from that side, not thinking about it from a systems perspective. And I think that's what we need to do, is kind of take it from both sides, from the policy to regulation, but also empowering people to know, if you are going to do a renovation in your bathroom, actually, maybe you need to think about better ventilation. Better ventilation then helps the air quality in your home. The air quality helps your heat in your home. So I think there's a lot of work that we can do there, and we need to support end users to understand this very much. But I think you're right, we're not there yet. And there's, that YouGov poll last week is a testament to that.
Awesome.
I would absolutely agree, but I also would just love every time someone wants to get their bathroom done or kitchen done, they get quotes, that those people that deliver there are skilled up and can say, oh, actually, when I take your kitchen out, I can put an internal wall insulation. You won't notice it, but it'll make your room warmer. And it just feels like we can talk theoretically, you're absolutely right. And we talk about the big companies, we talk about specifically about retrofit, but there's a lot of incremental improvements that could be made, just as kind of people are changing their kitchen and bathroom, repainting the walls, etc. And I think engaging those kind of tradespeople would be really powerful in that too. And the role of one-stop shops could be really useful in this.
Many thanks, Rob. David, any sort of further thoughts about how we make this popular, understandable, accessible, and all the rest?
Yeah, so you mentioned behavioural insights team, and it comes back, I think, for me, what I was trying to get at the beginning, that as an individual consumer, as an authority, as a landlord, you need to know what it means for you. What is it that you can do that will change for the better? And I think the key debate, and you can see the tensions around this, is how do we get a situation where people enjoy the same benefits, but in a way that's environmentally sustainable? It becomes essentially unsellable to be saying to people that you might have chosen to live in that rural area 200 miles from your family, knowing that because you had a car, that meant you could undertake your caring responsibilities. Well, now we've decided for the benefit of the planet, you can't have a car. That is just not manageable. Actually, we need to find a way to ensure that the person can still go and undertake those duties, can do the travel they want to do, but in a way that's environmentally effective. And the same with heating your home. Often the feedback that we hear from people about some of the new technologies is, I've installed this instead of a gas boiler, and now my house is cold. I don't like it, so I wouldn't buy it again. And we need to make sure that we get to a situation where the individual consumer can be confident, and the industry, as we just heard, that is offering those things can demonstrate that they work. Recent personal experience, building regs now require that you have mechanical ventilation in the bathroom. I know, certainly from my local authority experience, mechanical ventilation in bathrooms is not effective at preventing damp. And every installer I've ever spoken to has said, look, we have to put this in, but it's not going to work. What you really need to do is go open the window. That will fix the problem. So as a consumer, you're then left in a pretty much impossible position. I think that's where state action can sometimes help to resolve it, by making sure that people who are having that discussion with the consumer are able to give them really good information that builds confidence that these technologies, these types of energy supply or whatever, will work for that person and improve their quality of life.
Many thanks indeed, Dave. Anything further?
Yeah, I think it's probably quite a good one to finish on. This is from Pippa Palmer, who is a research strategist, retrofit at LSBU, who says, I'm speaking to local landlords who are worried by the press noise, but don't see a firm strategy or specific support for their sector. What should I say to reassure them? What should they do to prepare?
Okay, any answers? What words of reassurance?
To a local landlord. And I think LSBU, I think is London South Bank University, I think. So a local landlord in Elephant and Castle, what should you say to them?
Be hopeful, be optimistic.
I'd say be hopeful and optimistic, but I'm not the one that can offer the practical advice tomorrow. I mean, there are various different funding sources and sources of advice already, but I think I would hope that in at least in a year or two, these technologies will have a lot better picture of kind of which the solutions are going to be, and we'll have hopefully a kind of more comprehensive policy package that will feed and support these people. I mean, if nothing else, I haven't mentioned the UK Infrastructure Bank, which is mentioned in by the government repeatedly, kind of supporting local authorities. There will be hopefully some more kind of options like that coming down the line as well.
Cool.
David, when we talked earlier before about other ways of investing in this industry, what would reassurance could you offer on that front?
Yeah, so for example, the European Investment Bank, which in the UK is stepped away from, but we can still see what it's doing, has developed a lot of financial instruments that are designed to help landlords specifically around this, by generating an investment return, a kind that's likely to be attractive to, for example, pension funds. You can create longer term financial products whereby a landlord doesn't need to be passing all the costs onto ground rent or the service charges, whatever it may be, but can actually recover that over a much longer period of time, making it cost much more affordable. So I think that's probably a big part of it. And then the other factor is it does depend on the nature of the landlord and what their relationship is with their particular population of tenants. So it's different where you have a local authority, where you have a housing revenue account. So you can borrow against that housing revenue account. You can use that rental income to finance things which are for the general benefit of that housing stock, which is a slightly different setup to what we find the registered social landlord or indeed a private commercial landlord. But depending upon the nature of them, there will be a solution either available now or in development.
Many thanks, David. Last word, Erin, please.
Again, I think that the question's quite timely. This week, it was Land Invest had just launched a product onto the market for large asset owners with more favourable borrowing rates for those that want to move to a greener portfolio. So this is kind of coming down the line. We're seeing the likes of NatWest doing similar. We've seen Barclays in that space. I think it's knowing about what's actually in the market and starting to have some of those conversations.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Any final comments from anyone here in the room before we make it
Just
quick?
throw one
Second.
final one to the mix. Just one thing that we haven't discussed is the kind of measurement tool, and I hate to bring it back down to this level, but that's the EPC, and actually, of course, you mentioned in your kind of opening bit about the flaws of the EPC. Now, because the EPC is based on energy cost per square metre rather than energy efficiency, the cheapest fuel is going to get you the best EPC rating. Now, to give the landlords, as all these regulations come up in the future, you have to have an EPC band C. It's actually quite a contradictory kind of proposal, because in order to get that better EPC, you're more inclined to use something higher carbon. So how do we get UK government to finally address the issues with the EPC? And we've actually seen Scotland just in the last 12 months propose something that doesn't go all the way, but it goes some of the way in fixing that problem.
Is there a quick response we can give before we wrap up?
Well, I'd make a suggestion. So I personally think EPCs are at the moment not meaningful to the house purchaser. Most people don't really care about it. What they care about is the house warm and dry. So I think we need to move that into a space where it means something to the householder. And that may be about adopting an approach that we see with other forms of regulation, where what we say is we're not going to specify what it has to be, but what we will do is start to specify minimum standard. And I think we're already going a bit in that direction, and the controversy about what it means for people's mortgages and things like that has already surfaced. But I think if we're going to get to the point where we are making a meaningful difference without one size fits all, what we need to be doing is setting that minimum standard to an appropriate level, and then recognising that the householder or the landlord can implement the measures that they need to achieve it. So we're not saying how, but we are saying this is the minimum that we expect in this country.
Many thanks. Any final? In which case, I am going to wrap this session up. Let's give a huge round of applause to our panel, Ross, David, and truly great. I know I learned so much, from them. Really, they push this policy agenda forwards, as we hopefully will in the future. Thank you for everyone too for coming up, both in person and on Zoom. At least you made the hybrid work for the event, maybe not technology quite so fun. Final thanks to our sponsors, the National Residential Landlords Association, Property Mark, for enabling us to do this very important face-to-face research. Thank you, everyone. All the best. Thank you.